Welcome back to the channel, I'm glad you're here. So today we got this piece of live edge walnut and we're going to turn her into a serving board or charcuterie board. Now the first thing we're going to want to do here is remove all the bark from the live edge. I'm just using a paint scraper to do this. Technically not a woodworking tool, but it gets the job done. And for any parts of the bark that are a bit more difficult, I'm just using my rubber mallet here for a little bit of extra persuasion. Now I'm taking my drill with a brass wire wheel on it. This is going to help remove the remainder of the bark we couldn't get off with the scraper. Now honestly, with a board like this, the brass wire wheel might be a little bit of overkill. We could just accomplish this with a power sander, which is what we're going to use next here. So I got my random orbit sander with some 80 grit sandpaper on it. And to finish cleaning up live edges, what I like to do with the sander is have it on a bit of an angle and just use the edge of the sander to remove the remaining material. I find this makes faster work and is a lot easier to control. I find it also helps preserve the overall shape of the live edge. So we also got this knot here right in the center of the board. It goes all the way through and is pretty loose, so she's got to go and we'll fill it up with resin later. I'm just using a flathead screwdriver to remove the knot, really nothing fancy at all. And then once it's removed, I'll use a knife and some sandpaper to clean up any of the remaining debris. Now, since I'm the world's most original person, I'm gonna do something you've probably never seen here on YouTube. That's pour some epoxy. Pretty wild concept, I know. But first I want to cut this board in half so we can make our river. I also want to make sure that the knot is included in the final project. So ultimately I'm gonna cut this board a little left of center. So once we get our line drawn, I'm just gonna take my circular saw and make the cut. The mold box I have here is just made of some scrap wood and MDF I had lying around. I used tuck tape to make the demolding process easier, and then just used some cheap all-purpose caulking to seal up all the edges to prevent any leaks. The next thing we're going to want to do is add some weight to our two pieces of walnut here. Doing this is going to help prevent the walnut from floating once we pour our resin. Now for this I'm just using some scrap pieces of 1x3 and an old weight I found precariously placed above them. Now I'm not saying when you weigh down your project that you should do it this way. There's definitely safer and better ways to do this without the risk of having a 10-pound weight ending up in your epoxy pour. But at the end of the day, this worked. The epoxy I'm using for this pour is called Ice Cast. It's become my go-to over the past couple of years. I've honestly never had a real problem working with it that wasn't my fault. It's a 2-to-1 mix ratio, and depending on the ambient temperature, it sets up in a couple of days, which is more or less standard for these types of pours. We're going simple with this at the end of the day. I like the look of black epoxy with walnut, so I'm adding a decent amount of black tint to this resin, so we're left with solid black epoxy. And a couple days later, the resin's all set up, so we'll just break apart our mold box here and pry off our board. Now we got to get this thing back to level and remove the wasted epoxy. So we're going to do this over on the router sled. I have a flattening bit on it that I bought a few years back. It definitely was the most budget bit I could find. It does more hurting than helping, which you can see with the amount of tear out it did to the resin on this board. Luckily that's all easily fixable, and by the time you're seeing this video, be assured that that bit's been retired. Now that we got the board all nice and flat, we're just going to go ahead and start squaring up all the sides. I'm just doing this with my circular saw and a scrap piece of 1x3 as my guide. A Trek saw definitely would make this a lot easier, but you can definitely make do without one. I want to give everything a quick sand before we go ahead and fill up all this tear out on the resin. I'm using 80 grit sandpaper here on my orbital sander, and the hope is, at least in my mind, is that this will reduce some of the tear out areas. It'll also give the flood coat of epoxy we're going to use something to bite onto. I'm going to use some methyl hydrate and a clean cloth to get rid of all the debris from sanding. This will dry fast and won't leave any residue on the wood, and more importantly at this point on the resin. Once we've got everything nice and cleaned up, I'm just going to mix up about 1 ounce of the epoxy resin, which for the amount we have to fill is probably a little much, and we're also going to want to tint it black. Since there's more tear out than I'd like on this, as opposed to spot filling everything, I'm just going to do a flood coat over the epoxy, trying my best to avoid as much of the walnut as I can. And once it's all tacked up, we just repeat the same process on the other side. Alright, so our flood coat on both sides is cured up. Now we're just going to go ahead and sand her back down to level with the board. So rectangles are a little bit boring. Now that everything's sanded up, I want to give this board a little bit of shape. So I'm just going to freehand some curves onto this and also give it a handle. Once I'm happy with the shape I drew, I cut everything out with a jigsaw. And I'm also using a Forstner bit in the center of the handle to remove the majority of the material before I cut the rest out. Now once we got everything cut out, I'm going to take the board over to the spindle sander and just start cleaning up and refining the shape. So after we're done refining the shape, I'm going to clamp the board down to my work surface, and using a 1/4 inch roundover bit with my router, I'm going to add a roundover to the edges of the board. Here I'm just taking some sandpaper and doing a little bit of cleanup on the roundovers we just did. There's a little bit of a burn on the wood, so I want to make sure that we take care of that before we carry on. So now I want to take everything down to its final sand. I'm going to sand this board down to 220 before we go ahead and water pop it. Now if you're unfamiliar with what water popping is, what you want to do is after your final grit of sandpaper, so in this case 220, you're going to wet the surface of your board. What this is going to do is raise the grain, and once that's fully dried, you're just going to sand it again with the last grit of sandpaper you used. So in this case it's going to be 220. This is going to prevent the board from feeling rough or fuzzy as it gets used and washed over its lifetime. So be sure when you're making a board of your own to not skip this step. Alright, so we can start to see some light at the end of the tunnel with this project here. I'd like to say if you made it this far, thank you. It really does mean a lot. I know there's probably more exciting things you could be doing with your time, so I really am glad you're here. So if you feel like it, subscribe and maybe leave a like. Anyways, let's carry on. So now that we've got the board all sanded after the water pop, and we gave it a quick clean to make sure we got rid of any sawdust, the next thing we're going to want to do is add some protection. So for this I like to just use food safe mineral oil and then finish it off with some board butter. So all we want to do here is pour a little bit of the mineral oil on the surface of the board, and then with a clean cloth we're just going to work it into the surface. Once we have everything all evenly coated, I usually like to let this sit overnight. Then I come back the following day with a clean cloth and just wipe up all of the excess oil. And here you can see after we've wiped off all the excess oil, I'm just rubbing in some of this board butter, and this is going to be our final protective coat. And it's just as simple as that. You got yourself a completed serving board or a cheese board or charcuterie board, whatever you want to use it for, call it. And just like that, we're done. This is a pretty simple project just about anybody can do. You don't need much space, you don't need many tools, and if you want to start adding resin to your woodworking projects, doing a small board like this is a good way to get started. Definitely a lot cheaper and easier than starting with coffee tables or dining tables. Definitely a good way to get your feet wet. Anyways, if you made it to the end here, I really want to thank you. If you feel so inclined, subscribe and leave a like, and I'll hopefully see you in the next video. Thanks again.